The forest was breathing again. Autumn rain whispered through the leaves, touching every branch with silver. The river below Timber Run murmured softly in the dawn, carrying its endless secrets downstream. Elias stood still beneath the canopy, his breath visible in the cool air. The world smelled of pine and rust, of earth that had seen too much time pass. Ranger, his old shepherd dog, sniffed the air before trotting toward the riverbank, tail wagging cautiously. Elias adjusted the strap of his worn leather satchel and followed, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. "There are sounds that never fade," he murmured, voice rough from years of silence. "Like the river out there, it keeps flowing even when the ones who listened are long gone." The rain thickened, and for a moment he thought he could hear something beneath it. Not quite a voice, not quite memory, but something that pulled. Ranger barked once, sharply. Elias's eyes followed the dog's gaze. The river had swollen from the storm, its current clawing at the roots of a massive birch leaning dangerously over the edge. And there, caught beneath the roots, half buried in mud, was something metallic. He stepped closer. His fingers brushed aside the wet leaves. A small iron box, edges corroded, a dull reddish-brown like dried blood. He tugged gently, and it came loose with a sucking sound. For a long moment, he just stared. The box was no bigger than his hand, sealed with a strip of rusted clasp. On the top, faintly etched through the grime, were two letters, L.C. He froze. The sound of the rain faded away. L.C. Lydia Cole, his sister's initials. His mind went blank, then flooded. A flicker of laughter echoed in his head, high, clear like wind chimes, the scent of summer flowers. A girl in a white dress leaning against the window frame, hair catching the sunlight. "Eli," she had said once, twirling a daisy between her fingers. "If you listen closely, you can hear the river talking. It only tells secrets to those who remember." He could still see her smile, that half-mischievous, half-sad curve of her lips before the memory cracked and scattered like shattered glass. He swallowed hard. How long had it been since she vanished? 15 years? 16? Time had a cruel way of numbing, even grief. You forget the exact date, the season, even the way someone laughed, but not the silence they leave behind. That silence stays. He sat down on a damp rock, the box resting on his knees. His fingers trembled slightly as he tried to pry it open. The rust resisted. Ranger wound softly beside him, head resting against Elias's leg, sensing something deeper than his master's quiet. "It's been a long time, hasn't it, Gur?" Elias whispered to the river. "Since the day everything stopped." He finally forced the clasp free. The lid creaked open. Inside was a folded piece of paper, sealed inside a plastic sleeve yellowed with age. Beneath it, something glimmered faintly, a small silver charm in the shape of a feather. He lifted the charm, cold, smooth, perfectly preserved. Lydia's favorite. The feather charm she wore every day until the day she disappeared. He unfolded the paper carefully. Water had bled the ink, but the words were still visible, shaky but unmistakably hers. "If you're reading this, Eli, it means the river brought you back." He stared at the line for a long time, unable to breathe. His heart pounded like thunder. The forest seemed to lean in, listening. "Don't look for me," the next line read. "Not yet. Just remember what we buried." He felt the ground sway beneath him. What we buried. His mind spun back through the years to the summer before everything went wrong. The small cabin by the river, the two of them, young and restless, running through the woods with their pockets full of dreams. The night the storm came. The argument. Lydia's voice shouting through the rain. And then nothing. Elias blinked back to the present. The river was still there, endless and indifferent. Ranger barked again, softer this time, as if calling him home. But there was no home anymore, only the river, and his box that had waited for him. He looked out at Timber Run. The surface rippled under the rain, reflecting the gray of the sky. Somewhere beneath that water, his past was still alive, whispering. "You never really left, did you?" he said quietly. "You just hid somewhere I couldn't find." The letter trembled in his hands. He folded it back, placed it gently in the box, and closed the lid. Ranger pressed close to his leg, eyes following his every move. "Let's go, boy," Elias said. "We're not done here." He rose to his feet. Behind him, the river kept whispering, and for a moment, just a flicker, he thought he heard it say her name, Lydia. The sound cut through him like a blade in a bomb at once. He turned toward the trail leading back into the woods, rain soaking through his coat, the weight of the box pressing against his palm. The world felt suddenly smaller, or maybe it was just that the past had grown larger as he disappeared among the trees. The river carried on, Tyler's ancient, unchanged, flowing through time the same way memory flowed through him. The fire in Elias's cabin burned low, painting the walls in restless amber. Outside, The forest exhaled mists. Rain tapped faintly against the roof, a rhythm the mountains had always known. On the old wooden table sat the iron box. It looked almost alive now, breathing with the same pulse that stirred in his chest. He had carried it all the way back from the river, every step echoing with questions he wasn't ready to ask. Now, beneath the soft flicker of the lamp, he finally opened it. Inside, the past waited. He set each item out one by one, as though unwrapping memories from beneath layers of dust. First, a photograph folded, water-stained, the corners curled like old leaves. He smoothed it flat against the table. The image came into focus slowly. 3 figures smiling at the camera, sunlight spilling behind them. Lydia, in her white summer dress, her eyes bright, laughter courtmid. To her right himself, younger, Lena, unaware of how heavy life would become. And beside them, a boy with sharp eyes and a grin that carried too much confidence for his age, Ryan Hale. Elias felt the name surface like something that had been sleeping too long. Ryan, the son of the timber mill owner, the one everyone said Lydia was too good for, the one who always looked at her like he'd already claimed her. Elias ran a thumb across the photograph of Ryan's face. He remembered the summer festival of 1995, the scent of caramel corn, the Ferris wheel turning slow against a pink sky, Lydia's laughter rising above the crowd. That night, the 3 of them had stood near the riverbank, fireworks painting their faces in bursts of red and gold. Ryan had given Lydia a silver necklace, a heart-shaped pendant, delicate, shining under the lantern light. Elias picked up that same necklace now, lying beside the photo. The chain had darkened, but the heart was still smooth, cold, unbroken. "She never took this off," he whispered. He could still hear her voice, faint and fading. "Ryan says it's a promise," she had laughed, spinning in the grass. "But I think promises are only as strong as the people who make them." Then the night had fallen apart. Elias blinked hard, forcing himself back to the table. The next items were fragments, sheets of paper, fragile and stuck together from moisture. He tried to separate them carefully, but the ink had bled into gray rivers, words dissolving into ghosts. Only a few letters could still be read: bridge, run, don't tell. The rest was lost to time. Beneath the papers lay a key, small, rusted, and carved with 2 letters, R.B. Elias turned it over in his palm. It didn't fit anything he knew. Not the cabin, not Lydia's old chest. R.B. The initials burned in his mind. Ryan Hale's father had owned a cabin near Blackridge Bend, a private property by the mill road. Could it be that? He leaned back in his chair, staring at the fire. The warmth reached his hands but not his bones. The forest outside was still, but his mind wasn't. It began pulling him backward, unwillingly, into that night, the night Lydia disappeared. He remembered the way the air had smelled wet smoke and pine sap, the sound of an approaching jeep, headlights slicing through the fog, Lydia standing near the gate, rain in her hair, tears streaked with mud. "Eli, please," she had said. "You don't understand." He'd shouted back something he couldn't even recall now. Just anger, fear, the need to protect her from something he didn't have the words for. Ryan's car had appeared then, rumbling down the trail. He'd stepped out, his jacket soaked, voice low but hard. "She's coming with me." Elias remembered grabbing her wrist, feeling how cold her skin was. "Lydia, don't." But she had only looked at him, eyes full of something between love and regret, and then she pulled free, the door slammed, the jeep disappeared into the rain. That was the last time he saw her. He sat in silence now, the memory still echoing, the sound of tires crushing gravel, the red taillights fading into darkness. "If I had just kept her there," he whispered. "If I hadn't let her go." The thought clawed at his chest. Regret is a river that never stops flowing, it just finds new paths through your heart. Ranger stirred by the door, ears twitching. Elias looked at the dog, then at the photograph again, 3 faces frozen in sunlight, unaware of how the years would drown them. He gathered the objects carefully back into the box, but the key he kept in his hand, the initials gleamed faintly in the firelight. B. He didn't know what it opened, but he knew it was the next step. The letter from Lydia had said, "Remember what we buried." Maybe she hadn't meant it metaphorically. Maybe there was something still out there beneath the roots, beneath the years. He stood slowly, joints stiff, heart heavier than the box itself. Outside, the rain had stopped. The forest shimmered with mist, as if holding its breath. Elias looked once more at the photo, then slipped it into his coat pocket. "Come on, Ranger," he said quietly. "We're going down the mountain." The dog barked once low, loyal, certain. As Elias opened the door, cold air swept in, carrying the scent of pine and memory. The first light of dawn reached through the fog, touching the path below. Somewhere in that valley, the truth was waiting, and the river, still whispering through the trees, seemed to murmur in reply, a promise or a warning. Nothing stays buried forever. The road to Millford was the same as it had always been, narrow, cracked, winding through pines that leaned in like old witnesses. But the world around it had changed. Elias drove the old truck in silence, its engine growling like something half alive. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, head resting against the window, watching the trees blur by. The radio was off. The only sound was the hum of tires over gravel, a sound that used to mean coming home, but now felt like trespassing. The first houses appeared through the mist, pastel paint peeling, fences leaning, the faint smell of sawdust still clinging to the air. Millford, the town that had once lived off its timber, now felt like a ghost carving of itself. As Elias rolled down Main Street, faces turned quick, uncertain glances. People paused mid-step, conversations faltered. He saw a few familiar figures, Mrs. Olden from the post office, old Mr. Kemp still sweeping sidewalk outside his hardware store. They looked at him the way people look at a gravestone they'd rather forget was there. 12 years since he'd left this place, and yet the silence welcomed him like an old wound. He parked outside Maple Diner, the same cracked neon sign buzzing faintly against the gray morning, the same red booths through the fogged windows. The smell of burnt coffee and bacon fat hit him the moment he stepped inside. Heads turned, then turned away. The bell above the door chimed again as it shut. A sharp sound that seemed too loud for the room. Behind the counter, a woman with streaks of gray in her hair froze for half a second. Then she nodded faintly. Elias, Faye. He took a seat by the window. Ranger lay down by his feet, tail tapping softly against the floor. Faye poured coffee into a chipped mug and set it down without a word. Black, she said. You still take it that way. Always. Her eyes softened, then darted away. You shouldn't have come back. Elias looked out the window. The reflection of his own face looked like someone else's, older, harder. Maybe not, he murmured, but I think I finally have to. Faye hesitated, then leaned closer. He's here, comes every morning around 9. Elias didn't need to ask who. He waited. The coffee went cold. At exactly 9:05, the door opened. Wade Hollis stepped inside slower than Elias remembered, heavier in the shoulders. His uniform traded long ago for a brown jacket that still somehow carried authority. His beard was gray now, his eyes dull but alert, like a man who hadn't slept properly in decades. When he saw Elias, he stopped in the doorway. No words, just that long, weighted silence between two men who had once stood on opposite sides of something unspeakable. Then Hollis walked over and sat down across from him. The diner hummed softly around them, plates clinking. The hiss of the coffee machine, but it all sounded distant, unreal. Elias spoke first. You look the same. Don't lie, Hollis muttered. Elias almost smiled. Almost. Fair enough. They sat there, staring at their hands, the space between them filled with things they both remembered but never said. Finally, Elias asked, quietly but sharp, do you ever feel guilty, Wade? Hollis didn't flinch. He reached for his cup, stirred the coffee once, the spoon tapping the glass with a cold, metallic note that seemed to slice through the air. Guilt, he said after a long moment. It's something you learn to live with or die from. Depends which one finds you first. Elias studied him, the tremor in his hand, the deep lines etched around his mouth. You think I came back here to talk philosophy? No, Hollis said. You came back because of her. The words landed like a blow. Elias looked away. You could have done more, Wade. You should have. I did what I could, Hollis said, voice low, defensive but tired. The case went nowhere. No prints, no signs of struggle, just her car, and a river that swallowed everything. Elias leaned forward. His voice dropped to a near whisper. You called it a runaway. You let them say she just left. You closed it before the ground was even cold. She did leave, Hollis snapped, then caught himself, exhaled slowly. At least that's what I told myself back then, because it was easier than admitting the truth that I didn't want to dig deeper into something that could bury me too. The air thickened. The spoon hit the table. Somewhere, a truck rumbled past the diner, shaking the window slightly. Elias said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on Hollis. Steady as a blade, Hollis sighed. You've been gone 12 years. You think this town hasn't tried to forget. You think you're the only one who lies awake hearing the river. Elias looked down. The reflection of the coffee in his cup rippled slightly dark. Endless. I found something, he said finally. In the river, a box. Her box. Hollis froze. What kind of box? Metal. Rusted. Inside a photo. Her necklace. Papers with her handwriting. And a key. Hollis's fingers twitched. You shouldn't have opened it. Elias's jaw tightened. Why not? Because some things, Hollis said, leaning in, his voice barely above a whisper, were meant to stay buried. Elias, you dug them up. You won't just find the dead, you'll find the ones still breathing who should have gone with them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The diner was quiet, save for the faint buzz of the neon and the clink of glass somewhere behind the counter. Elias's heart beat slow and hard. You know something, he said. Hollis didn't answer. I can see it. Elias pressed. In your eyes. You've been carrying this for 30 years. Finally, Hollis met his craze. There was no denial there, just exhaustion, and maybe, buried deep beneath it, shame. I can't help you, he said. Not this time. He stood up, threw a few bills on the table, and walked out. Elias watched him go, the bell above the door chiming once again that same cold, final sound. The seat across from him was empty, but it felt full of ghosts. Ranger lifted his head, whining softly. Elias reached down, running a hand through the dog's fur. He's hiding something, he murmured. They all are. Outside, the clouds broke apart, and sunlight hit the window weak and thin, like light filtered through dirty glass. Millford looked normal again, like any small town. But Elias could feel it in his gut. This place hadn't forgotten. It had buried, and now that the past had begun to rise, there would be nowhere left for anyone to hide. The storm broke that evening, but the air in Elias's chest still felt heavy. He'd driven west of town, down the cracked two-lane road that led past the old lumberyards, where the woods pressed too close and the sky felt lower than it should. The headlights of his truck carped through the mist until he saw the flicker of a neon sign, Brooks Roadhouse. The bar looked like it had been built out of regret boards warped by rain, a single light burning over the doorway. Inside, the smell of whiskey, smoke, and damp wood filled the room. A jukebox murmured somewhere in the back, too low to make out the song. Behind the counter stood Angela Brooks, older now, hair tied up in a careless knot, a cigarette hanging from her lips. She froze when she saw him. Carter, her voice cracked slightly. You shouldn't be here. He took off his cap, rain dripping down his jacket. Neither should you, he said softly, but here we are. Angela let out a short, dry laugh. Still the same old soldier, always where the ghosts are. Elias, still the photograph across the bar, the one from the box. The summer of 1995. Lydia in her white dress, Ryan's arm around her shoulders, Angela smiling on the other side, sunlight caught in her hair. You were there, Elias said. You saw them. Angela's eyes softened. She picked up the photo, stared at it for a long time, then set it down gently. I see her every night, she murmured. Lydia, she never really left this place. Not for me. Elias waited, the sound of rain ticking against the window like an old clock. They loved each other, Angela began, more than they should have. Ryan was different back then. He wanted to make things right. Ryan, Elias asked. He found something, Angela said, lowering her voice. Something about his father, and Hollis. Elias felt his chest tighten. Wade Hollis. She nodded. Back then, the mill wasn't just cutting timber. They were taking trees from the reserve federal land. Illegal logging. Ryan found the paperwork, photos, enough to shut it all down. Her hand trembled slightly as she poured herself a drink. He told Lydia, she continued, said he had proof evidence that would make everything fall apart. Those were his words. He was going to meet a man that night. Someone who'd help him take it to the authorities. Elias's voice was low. And then he fell from the water tower. Angela's eyes glistened. That's what they said. But Ryan wasn't the kind of boy who climbed towers for fun. He was careful, thoughtful. He was scared. Elias, that week he told Lydia if anything happened to him, she should hide the evidence. Elias felt the air in the bar thicken. The sound of the jukebox faded. Did she? Angela looked down at the counter. She swore to him she would. 2 weeks later, she vanished, just like that. The car on the logging road. Door open. No Lydia. Silence settled between them, the kind that comes from shared guilt. Angela took a sip of her drink, eyes distant. We were just kids. We didn't know what power could do to people. Hollis, Mr. Hale, they wanted that land. Elias, the kind of money you kill for. Elias clenched his fists, the sound of his leather gloves tightening. You're saying Lydia knew who killed Ryan? Angela hesitated, then nodded slowly. I think she saw something she wasn't supposed to, and she paid for it. For a long moment, Elias didn't speak. The fire in his chest burned steady, cold, and focused. Angela reached below the counter, rummaged through a drawer, and came up with a small, dust-covered box. She placed it in front of him. What's that? Elias asked. A roll of film, she said, from Lydia's camera. She took pictures around the mill the week before she disappeared. I developed one roll for her back then, but she never came back for this one. I kept it, I don't know why. Elias picked it up gently. The black film glimmered faintly in the light. You think it still works? Angela shrugged. Maybe it's all blank. But if you really want to know what happened, it's in there. Elias met her gaze. Why tell me now? Angela's voice dropped to a whisper. Because I'm tired of hearing her voice in my dreams. Elias nodded. Then maybe it's time we both stopped dreaming. He tucked the film into his coat pocket that stood and put a few bills on the counter. As he turned to leave, Angela said softly, "Be careful, Elias. The living still whisper in this town, but not all of them whisper the truth." He paused at the door, the neon light flickering across his face. "If the truth's still whispering," he said, "then maybe it's time someone listened." That night, back at the cabin, the forest was unnaturally still. Elias sat by the window, staring at the roll of film on the table. The lamp cast a thin circle of light across it, the same way the moonlight had once touched Lydia's hair on summer nights long gone. The phone buzzed, an unknown number. He opened the message, "Let the dead sleep. Carter." The words were simple, but his blood ran cold. Ranger lifted his head, growling low, deep from the chest. His ears stood sharp, eyes fixed on the door. Elias turned off the lamp. The cabin fell into darkness. Outside, somewhere beyond the porch, a branch snapped clean. Deliberate sound of a boot on wood. He reached for the rifle leaning by the window. The night pressed close, thick and watching. Ranger's growl deepened, then broke into a snarl. Someone was out there. Elias's heart pounded once, hard. The rain started again, gentle but relentless. "You came too late to save her," he whispered to himself, steadying his breath. But maybe not too late to finish what she started. The river roared faintly in the distance, as if remembering, and outside, the living, whoever they were, whispered back through the storm. By morning, the storm had passed, but the cabin still smelled of wet pine and gun oil. Elias hadn't slept. The text message, "Let the dead sleep." Carter burned behind his eyes like a warning written in smoke. He sat at the kitchen table, the old wooden box open before him. Its contents were still damp from the night he'd found it. Scraps of paper, a few photographs, and something folded into quarters at the very bottom. He unfolded it carefully, drying it by the faint warmth of the stove. The ink had bled in places, but the handwriting slanted. Trembling was still legible. It was Lydia's. Her words crawled across the page like a confession written too late. "Ryan didn't fall. He was killed. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone too. There's a second box. Lucas knows." Elias read it twice, maybe 3 times. Every line carried the weight of a voice silenced long ago. He imagined her hands, dirt under her nails, fear in her eyes, writing those words in some lonely room, waiting for footsteps she knew would come. He folded the letter back and set it beside the film roll. On the table lay a small brass key, engraved faintly with 2 letters up. "B." Elias stared at it, lost in thought, until Ranger's tail brushed his boot. The dog looked up at him, ears pricked, waiting. "Yeah," Elias murmured. "I know. Time to move." Lucas Hale lived on the edge of town, in a restored farmhouse surrounded by young saplings, the kind of quiet, open place people retreat to when they've seen too much. Elias parked the truck by the fence. Lucas was already outside, splitting wood with a steady rhythm, his breath misting in the cold morning air. When he saw Elias, he froze, mid-swing. "Carter," he said. "I didn't expect you." Elias nodded. "No one ever does." Lucas leaned on the axe handle. He had Ryan's eyes, softer, but with the same flicker of something that once burned brighter. "I suppose this is about my brother," Lucas said. Elias held out the photograph, the same one he'd shown Angela. "You were there that day." Lucas nodded slowly. "We were kids. Ryan brought Lydia and Angela up to the ridge to see the water tower. He said the view was worth the climb." His jaw tightened. He wasn't the kind of guy who fell. Carter. He climbed that tower a dozen times before. Something happened up there, something no one wanted to talk about. Elias reached into his coat and handed him Lydia's letter. Lucas unfolded it, read it in silence. When he finished, he sat down on the porch step, the paper trembling in his hands. "She knew," he whispered. "She knew he didn't jump." Elias watched him quietly. "She said the second box. Lucas knows. You have any idea what that means?" Lucas ran a hand through his hair, thinking, "Back then, I didn't. But a few months ago, I started digging into Timber Ridge myself. I'm an environmental engineer now. I look at land reclamation, deforestation, all that. But when I pulled old permits and financial records," he hesitated. "What?" Elias pressed. "There were huge inconsistencies. Logs from protected land, fake shipment documents. Someone's been covering it up for decades. Hollis, probably. But he didn't work alone." Elias's voice was flat. "You've been threatened." Lucas gave a small, humorless smile. "You always were good at reading people." He pointed toward the side of the house, where a window pane was cracked clean down the middle. 2 nights ago, someone threw a rock through that. No note. Just that. Elias reached into his pocket, took out the brass key, and set it on the porch rail. You recognize this? Lucas's eyes widened. He picked it up, turned it over in his hand. R.B. Riverbend Storage. That's an old mill warehouse near the river, just past Blackridge Bend. That place still standing? Elias asked, barely. The company used it back in the 90s to store equipment, and Lucas stopped. Realization darning. And record boxes. Lydia used to go there with Ryan sometimes. He said it was where they'd hide from the noise. Elias looked out toward the tree line. The forest whispered softly, as if listening. So whatever they found, he said, it's probably still there. Lucas nodded. If it survived this long, inside the house. Lucas spread old maps across the dining table. The Riverbend facility sat near the fork of 2 rivers, remote, forgotten, swallowed by the woods. Elias leaned over the map, tracing the roads with a gloved finger. There's only one way in now, through Mill Creek Road. The bridge is out, then we hike, Lucas said simply. Elias looked at him. You're sure about this? Lucas's eyes hardened. Ryan died for something. Lydia too. I've lived with that silence my whole life. Carter, I'm done being afraid of it. Ranger, lying near the fireplace, lifted his head as if in agreement. Elias exhaled slowly. All right, we go tonight. The sun dipped low as they packed supplies, flashlights, rope, and the old revolver Elias still kept holstered under the seat of his truck. As they loaded the last bag, Lucas turned to him. You think we'll find it? The second box. Elias closed the truck door. Doesn't matter, someone doesn't want us looking. That's reason enough. They drove in silence for a long time, the forest swallowing the road until only the sound of gravel and the soft hum of the engine remained. By the time they reached the river bend, night had fallen. The warehouse loomed ahead, a silhouette of rust and ruin. Half collapsed against the tree line. Lucas killed the engine. The air was thick with the smell of wet moss and oil. Ranger wind softly. Elias turned off the headlights. The darkness pressed close around them. Stay sharp, he murmured, as they stepped out. A gust of wind carried across the water, and somewhere deep in the building, a metal door creaked open, slow and deliberate. Lucas froze. Did you? I heard, Elias said. He reached into his coat, feeling the brass key cold against his fingers. Looks like someone's been waiting, the river murmured in the dark, hearing the sound of their footsteps as they crossed the threshold into the forgotten warehouse where the dead had whispered, and the truth was still waiting to be found. The moon hung low above the river, pale and thin like a scar. The old warehouse crouched against the waterline, its roof sagging, its walls cloaked in ivy and rust. The place looked more like a wound than a building, something left to fester long after the world had moved on. Elias killed the truck's lights 100 yards out. We walk from here, he said. Lucas nodded. His breath curled white in the cold. The air smelled of iron and wet bark, the kind of smell that makes old ghosts stir. They moved through the tall grass, flashlights dark, their boots sinking into the soft river mud. Ranger padded silently at Elias's side. Only the wind made a sound, a low moan through the broken eaves. When they reached the door, Elias pushed it gently. The hinges gave a long, tired groan. Inside, darkness swallowed them whole. Dust drifted through the narrow beams of moonlight that slipped through holes in the roof. The air was cold enough to bite. Lucas switched on his flashlight. The beams swept across the floor, stacks of decayed crates, tangled wires and rusted machinery. Every corner whispered of things long forgotten. Jesus, Lucas murmured. It's like they just walked out one day. Maybe they did, Elias said. They advanced deeper. Their footsteps echoed, sharp and lonely. The flashlight cut through shadows, revealing faded stencils on the walls. Timber Ridge Industrial Storage, 1992. Elias's mind drifted back to that summer. Lydia's laughter by the water. Ryan's Jeep parked near the bridge. The scent of gasoline and cedar smoke. He swallowed hard and kept walking. Over here, Lucas whispered, in the far corner, half buried under a collapsed shelf, stood a massive steel container. The surface was covered in grime, but along its edge beneath the dust was a faint glimmer. Elias crouched, brushing the dirt away. His fingertips found it easily, a weld seam, too new for the rest of the structure. Someone sealed this, he said quietly. Lucas knelt beside him, shining the light closer. You think that's where? Only one way to find out. They pried loose a rusted crowbar from a nearby crate. The metal screamed as it bent under Elias's weight. Sparks danced briefly in the dark as the weld began to crack. Almost there, he muttered. One final pull and the seal broke. A thin plume of stale air escaped, smelling of oil and dust. Inside were boxes, stacked neatly, waterproof containers marked with faded company seals. Elias lifted the top one and brushed off the grime. Papers. Dozens of them. He flipped through the first stack. Invoicing records, shipment ledgers, internal memos. Most bore the same signatures. Harold Hale, CEO, Wade Hollis, Sheriff. Lucas leaned closer. This is proof. Illegal logging permits. Bribes to county officials. They buried everything here. Elias turned another page. Taped inside was a photograph, yellowed and bent. It showed Hollis and Harold Hale shaking hands beside a stack of lumber trucks, smiling, proud. He felt something tighten in his chest. They killed for this, he said softly. Ryan must have found out. Lydia too. Lucas's flashlight trembled slightly in his grip. We need to take these to the authorities, or someone. Anyone. Elias closed the folder. No one in Millford's clean. Not yet. For a moment. Silence. The steady hum of the river outside. The faint crackle of metal cooling in the night air. Then the sound of gravel shifting. Elias froze. Headlights flared briefly through a crack in the warehouse wall, then disappeared. An engine idled outside low. Heavy. Someone's here. Lucas whispered. Elias gestured sharply. Lights off. The warehouse plunged into darkness. They pressed themselves behind the container. Ranger crouched low, a faint growl vibrating in his chest. A truck door slammed shut. Footsteps crunched on gravel, slow, deliberate. Elias could see the faint glow of a cigarette near the entrance, then the flash of a lighter reflecting off something metallic. A voice. Deep, steady, too familiar. Make sure Carter doesn't come back. Elias's stomach turned to ice. Wade Hollis. He was older now, but his presence filled the space the same way it always had, with quiet authority and rot beneath the surface. He stepped into the beam of his own flashlight, sweeping it lazily across the room. The smoke from his cigarette curled like a ghost in the cold air. Damn rats in here, he muttered into his phone. I told you to torch this place last month. A pause. The faint buzz of a voice on the other end. Hollis listened, then laughed softly, a dry, humorous sound. No, I don't think he's that stupid, but if he is, we'll make sure the river takes him to. Elias's fingers tightened around the crowbar. Lucas shifted beside him, his breath ragged. Ranger's growl deepened. Elias pressed a hand to the dog's neck, stilling him. Hollis's flashlight passed just inches above their hiding place, grazing the edge of the container. Dust motes glimmered in the beam like tiny stars. He lingered for a moment, listening, then turned away. Seal it again, Hollis said. And this time, burn the records. The footsteps receded. A truck door slammed. The engine roared to life, fading into the distance until only the river remained. For a long time, neither Elias nor Lucas moved. Finally, Elias exhaled, slow, controlled. They know, he said. Lucas wiped the sweat from his brow. Then what now? Elias looked at the open container, the papers scattered across the floor, the photos still in his hand. We finish what Lydia started. Outside, the river rolled on, dark and endless, carrying secrets that refused to sink. By dawn, the road was nothing but mud and fog. Elias's truck groaned as it climbed the narrow path out of riverbed, headlights cutting through sheets of rain. Beside him, Lucas sat silent, his hands tight on his knees. The night's terror still clung to them, the echo of Hollis's voice, the crunch of boots too close in the dark. Ranger slept in the back seat, his fur sloped, tail twitching even in dreams. For miles, neither man spoke, only the wipers kept time, scraping across the glass like bones. Finally, Lucas said, "Where are we going?" Elias didn't take his eyes off the road. "There's a man named Douglas Avery, folks used to call him Doc, worked maintenance at Timberidge before the place went under." Lucas frowned. "You think he'll talk?" Elias gave a short, bitter laugh. "If he's still alive. He's been waiting 30 years too. They found him at the edge of town, in a trailer half swallowed by pine trees. The rain had softened to a drizzle, but the world still smelled of rust and sap. Douglas Avery opened the door before Elias even knocked. His hair was white now, his body shrunken. But his eyes, those sharp gray eyes, still carried a soldier's clarity. "Carter," he said softly, "didn't think I'd ever see you again." Elias nodded. "We need to talk, Doc." The old man stepped aside. "Then come in before the forest listens." Inside, the trailer was cluttered with old tools, maps, and the smell of tobacco. A small stove burned weakly in the corner. Douglas poured whiskey into 3 chipped mugs. "You always liked your secrets cold," he said, handing one to Elias. Lucas hesitated, glancing at the old man. "You worked at the mill." Douglas chuckled. "Worked there, drank there, nearly died there." He took a long sip. "What brings you here after all these years?" Elias set the mug down. "Lydia, The name hung in the air like smoke. Douglas froze, then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "So, you finally found the river's mouth?" Elias leaned forward. "Duck, I need to know, what happened that summer?" For a long time Douglas said nothing. The rain tapped gently against the tin roof. Then, slowly, he began. "It was July '95, he said. "Hot enough to boil the sap out of the trees. Ryan Hale had been snooping around the mill. Smart kid. Too smart. Started asking questions about the timber routes, the missing permits. Thought he was doing the right thing." Douglas stared into his mug. He wasn't wrong. Harold Hale and Hollis had been bleeding this valley for years, cutting where they weren't supposed to, selling off land that wasn't theirs. Ryan must have found the proof. Lucas shifted uneasily, and when they found out, Douglas nodded slowly. "They called it an accident. Said he fell off the water tower drunk, but I saw the bruises on his neck before they buried him. That wasn't no fall." The room went still. Elias's voice was low. "And Lydia," Douglas looked up at him, eyes tired, full of regret. "She came to me 2 nights later, said she had to tell someone, said she couldn't keep quiet about what they'd done to Ryan." He swallowed hard. "She was supposed to meet Hollis at the sheriff's office, said she'd give him one chance to come clean. That was the last time I saw her." The old man's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his pack of cigarettes. "Next morning, I came by the mill. Harold and Hollis were there, both of 'em muddy and mean. They told me to keep my mouth shut if I wanted to keep breathing," Lucas whispered. "You stayed quiet all this time." Douglas lit his cigarette, exhaling a ghost of smoke. "You ever see what happens to men who speak in small towns? Son, the forest takes their names first, then their bones." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded, water-stained map. "But I kept this. Couldn't throw it away." Elias unfolded the paper. It was a survey map of the old timber site with a red X drawn deep in the pine ridge, near the bend of the river. "That night," Douglas said quietly, "I saw Hollis drive out there with a tarp in the back of his truck. He came back alone." Elias's hand trembled as he traced the mark. "You're saying Lydia's buried there?" Douglas didn't answer. He didn't have to. The rain picked up again, drumming harder against the roof. Elias stared at the map, the lines of ink blurring as if the paper itself couldn't bear the truth. "I remember that night," he whispered. "I was down by the river, waiting for her. I saw her headlights through the trees. Then the rain started. I called her name." He closed his eyes. The memory came back in shards. Lydia's laughter fading into her yellow dress whipping in the wind, the sound of thunder swallowing her voice. "She dropped her necklace," Elias murmured. "It fell into the water. I went after it, but the current." His voice broke. Douglas put a hand on his shoulder. "You couldn't have saved her as son. Some things the river decides for itself." Lucas spoke softly. "So what do we do now?" Douglas's gaze drifted to the window, where rain streaks down like tears. "You finish it. You bring her home." He stubbed out his cigarette and met Elias's eyes. "The river doesn't forget, Carter. It just waits for someone to listen." When they left the trailer, dawn was breaking, a pale, cold light stretching over the hills. The map lay folded in Elias's coat pocket, the red X burning against his chest. The forest shivered in the wind. The river murmured beyond the trees, soft and endless. And for the first time in 30 years, Elias felt that the past, no longer haunting him from behind, but calling him forward. The wind was sharper that night. It howled through the pines and pressed cold fingers against the windows of the cabin. Elias sat at the table, staring at the scattered papers and the dim light trembling on the walls. Ranger's breathing was steady by the door, but every now and then his ears twitched. The woods were never truly silent. They whispered, shifted, waited. Then came the crunch of tires on gravel. Ranger lifted his head, growling low, a deep rumble that came from his chest. Elias's hand froze above the table. He turned off the lamp. The cabin sank into shadow. Through the window, he saw headlights blink once, then vanish. Whoever it was, they'd killed the engine. Elias moved quietly to the cabinet, loading a single round into his father's old rifle. His pulse was calm to calm. The door creaked open before he reached it, and there, framed by the faint silver of the moonlight, stood Hollis, coat damp, hat tilted low, a pistol glinting in his hand. His breath was uneven, but his eyes were steady. "I told you to stop digging," Cartha Hollis said, voice low, gravelly. "You should have burned that letter when you found it." Elias didn't move. "You came all the way out here to give me advice?" Hollis took a step closer, boots leaving wet marks on the wooden floor. "This isn't just about your sister," he said. "You think she was the only one they silenced? There were others. You keep pushing, and you'll pull down everything. You, me, the whole damn town." Elias's eyes didn't leave his. "Maybe it deserves to fall." A flicker crossed Hollis's face, something between anger and regret. "You don't understand. I tried to keep the peace. I told Harold not to what?" Elias cut in. "Not to dump Ryan's body by the river. Not to lie to Lydia until she broke." Hollis's hand tightened around the pistol. "You don't know what it's like, Carter. I've seen men die for pride, for loyalty, for damn nothing. I did what I had to." Elias stepped forward, slow and steady. "I've seen men die, too. But I've never seen one kill for fear until now." The silence after that was heavy. Even the wind seemed to stop listening. Then came the sound: click, a flash of metal. The gun lifted, and the night exploded. The bullet tore through the window, blast shattering into the dock. Ranger lunged, teeth bared, barking like thunder. Hollis stumbled back, cursing, the pistol slipping from his grasp. Elias ducked behind the table, hot hammering now, the rifle pressed against his shoulder. "Stay down, Ranger," he shouted, but the dog wouldn't listen. He rushed forward, knocking Hollis off balance. The two crashed into the doorframe, the gun clattering away into the shadows. Outside, headlights flared. A second vehicle, tires screeched on wet ground. Elias turned sharply. A figure stepped out, holding a flashlight and a revolver. Elias, it was Lucas. He raised the gun toward the sky and fired once, a warning shot that echoed like a thunderclap through the valley. Hollis froze. "Put it down," Lucas shouted. "It's over." But Hollis didn't. He backed toward the trees, shaking his head. "You don't know what you're doing, kid. You think truth fixes anything. Truth destroys. It always does." His heel caught the edge of the old wooden step. The world slowed. Elias watched as Hollis's foot slipped on the wet boards, arms flailing for balance. His eyes met Elias's one last time, wild, desperate, almost pleading. Then his body twisted, falling backward into the darkness beyond the porch. There was a thud, then the faint splash of water meeting flesh. The river below, swollen from the storm, swallowed him whole. Lucas ran to the edge, pointing his light downward. "He's gone," he whispered. The beam danced over the surface, but there was nothing, just the current, thick, brown, and restless, moving on. Elias stood still, rifle hanging loosely by his side. The air was cold enough to sting. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the rush of the river, steady, indifferent, eternal. Finally, Lucas turned to him. "Do you think he meant it? About your sister, about others?" Elias didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted toward the water, where the moonlight shimmered faintly on the ripples. "He meant every word," Elias said quietly. "But the truth doesn't care about what men mean." Ranger padded to his side, muzzle wet, fur glistening. Elias knelt, resting a hand on the dog's head. "He's gone," Lucas said again. Elias nodded slowly. "No," he murmured. "He just went where they all end up, back to the river." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called Long Hollow, almost mournful. Elias looked out into the blackness, eyes unreadable. He felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only the quiet weight of something that had been waiting a long time to end. And in that silence, that deep, living silence, the river whispered again, its voice low and steady, as if reminding him it never forgets, it only waits. The morning broke, cold and gray. Mist hung low over the valley, holding the trees into silence. Down by the old timber ridgeside, the hum of engines and the crunch of boots on gravel filled the air. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind. Elias stood behind it, coat zipped to his throat, watching as the state police marked off the ground. The map Douglas Avery had given him was spread across the hood of a cruiser, corners pinned by coffee cups and muddy fingers. The sergeant leaned in, comparing landmarks. Old sycamore by the bend, half a mile west of the mill road. He looked up. "You sure this is where?" Elias nodded once. Douglas never lied. He just waited too long to speak. Ranger sat by his leg, quiet eyes fixed on the digging tools. The dog hadn't barked since dawn. It was as if he already knew what they'd find. The first shovelfuls of earth came up dark and heavy, smelling of rain and iron. Each strike of metal on dirt echoed through Elias's chest like a heartbeat he didn't want to claim. He didn't move closer. He just watched. The wind carried fragments of conversation, measurements, coordinates, soft curses under breath. Then a sudden call. "Something here." The voices changed. A cluster of men gathered around the pit, flashlights angling inward though it was barely mid-morning. One of them raised a gloved hand, signaling the sergeant to the chatted dimmed. Elias walked forward before anyone told him he could. He saw the shape first, faint, fragile, half swallowed by clay. The curve of bone, pale against the dark soil. The remains were small, slender, still wrapped in the tattered remnant of a blue jacket. the jacket Lydia used to wear when they walked by the river. Elias's throat tightened, but no sound came. The world moved around him, people talking, photographing, measuring, but it was like standing underwater. One of the officers turned toward him, voice gentle. "Mr. Carter, we also found this." He handed Elias a small metal box, corroded at the edges but still locked. The initials were faint, scratched deep into the lid. L. C. Elias took it carefully, thumb brushing the rust. He didn't need a key. The clasp gave way easily, as if it had been waiting for him. Inside lay a small roll of 8mm film, a few damp documents, and a folded letter sealed with red wax, the kind Lydia used when she still believed secrets could be protected by something as fragile as ritual. He unfolded it with slow, trembling hands. The paper was soft from years underground, words written in Lydia's familiar, uneven handwriting. "If you're reading this, Elias, it means I failed. It means they found me before I could make anyone listen. But at least, now the truth won't stay buried. You always said the river remembers everything. Maybe the earth does too. Tell them what they did to Ryan. Tell them what they did to this town. Don't let it end with silence. Love, always Lydia." The ink had bled in places, but her name was still clear. Elias read it twice, then again, until the words no longer looked like words, only lines, shapes, ghosts of sound. His fingers shook, but his eyes stayed dry. He folded the letter back, slow and precise. As though returning it to her, the sergeant approached quietly. "We'll have the forensics team handle the rest. You don't have to stay." But Elias didn't move. He looked down at the open earth, at the place where she had waited all these years, and said, "No, she shouldn't be alone again." The sun finally broke through the clouds, faint and weak, glinting on the wet soil. It looked almost like water. Ranger shifted beside him, pressing his head against Elias's leg. A low whine escaped him, soft and human-like. Elias placed a hand on the dog's neck. "It's all right, boy," he murmured. "We found her." The breeze carried the smell of pine and rain, and for a moment Elias thought he could hear her laughter, faint, distant, like it was coming from the riverbank long ago. Hours later, as the last evidence bags were sealed and the crews packed up, an officer approached with a clipboard. "We also pulled someone from the river this morning," he said, "downstream near the dam. It's Hollis." Elias turned slightly. "Elias?" The officer nodded barely. "He's at County General, refuses to talk, won't answer a single question." Elias looked past him toward the line of trees, toward the water glinting faintly through the fog. "Then he's already said enough," he whispered. When the last truck left and the sound of engines faded, the woods went still again. Elias remained by the grave a long time, the box clutched to his chest. The light dimmed. The ground began to cool. Ranger sat faithfully beside him, his fur brushing against Elias's boots. Finally, Elias looked up at the sky bruised with the first trace of evening and said softly, almost to himself, "She wasn't wrong. The truth doesn't die. It just waits under the dirt, under the lies, until someone's brave enough to dig." He looked once more at the open ground, then at the river winding quietly beyond the trees. It moved the same way it always had, steady, patient, eternal, and as he turned to leave, the wind rose again, carrying with it the faintest sound like a whisper breaking free from the soil. Not buried, found. The trial ended in early spring. When the verdict was read guilty on all counts, no one in the courtroom made a sound. Hollis sat motionless at the defense table, his hands folded, his eyes empty. He didn't look at Elias, he didn't look at anyone. Outside, reporters shouted, cameras clicked, but it all sounded distant, like rain on another roof. Elias walked past them without a word. The town of Millford had waited 12 years to say the word justice, yet somehow it didn't feel like victory. It felt like silence, the kind that follows a storm too large to understand. The Timber Ridge Corporation was shut down within a week. Excavators tore through the ruins of the mill, unearthing barrels of waste, records of bribes, and names that had long been untouchable. For the first time in decades, the river behind it ran clear again. The papers called it the Timber Run Redemption, but Elias knew redemption wasn't found in headlines. It was a gray morning when he drove out to the cemetery on the hill. The wind carried the scent of wet pine, and the earth was soft beneath his boots. He carried a small urn in his hands, Lydia's ashes. Finally, at rest after all those years underground, beside the old oak tree lay two familiar names carved in stone, Henry and Margaret Carter. Their headstones had gathered moss, but the letters were still legible. Patient as memory, Elias knelt between them, digging a shallow hollow in the soil. He placed the urn inside, brushed the dirt gently around it, then sat back on his heels. From his coat pocket, He drew out the small silver heart-shaped locket, Lydia's necklace, dulled by time but still whole. The chain slid from his fingers and landed softly atop the earth. He exhaled, voice low and steady. You always said the truth was like the river, can be dammed, poisoned, or forgotten for a while, but it never dies. His gaze drifted to the horizon, where the hills curved into mist. The wind caught the loose ends of his scarf, whispering through the trees like a voice he once knew. You were right, Lyd. It took me 30 years to listen, but you were right all along. He stayed there a long time. No tears, no speeches, just a quiet man beside the people he'd loved and lost. Ranger lay beside the grave, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed for a moment. Everything, the wind, the trees, even the sky seemed to still. Later that week, Lucas Hale came by the cabin. His truck was loaded with planks, tools, and a thermos of coffee. They spent the afternoon at the riverbank, rebuilding the old wooden bridge that had once connected the Carter land to the Hale property. It had rotted years ago, like most things in Millford, but the posts still stood, half-sunk and stubborn, waiting to be reclaimed. Neither man spoke much. Lucas hammered while Elias steadied the beams, the sound of wood meeting metal echoing softly across the valley. By dusk, they had nearly finished. The new bridge stretched gracefully across Timber Run, not perfect, not polished, but strong. Lucas leaned against the railing, looking down at the water. You think it ever really forgets? Elias followed his gaze. The river was calm, its surface catching the first stars of evening. No, he said quietly, it forgives, but it remembers. Lucas nodded, hands in his pockets. I used to think my brother ran away because he was ashamed. Turns out, he was just brave too early. Elias glanced at him. He was brave exactly when he needed to be. The younger man smiled faintly, eyes damped but peaceful. Emma's been asking questions, he said. She wants to know who her father was. Maybe you could tell her. Elias didn't answer right away. The river filled the silence between them, steady and endless. Finally, he said, bring her by tomorrow. Some stories shouldn't be left to ghosts. The next afternoon, a soft knock echoed on the cabin door. When Elias opened it, a girl stood there, maybe 12, maybe 13, holding a worn photograph of a young man with kind eyes and a crooked grin. Mr. Carter, she asked. My name's Emma Hale. He nodded, his throat tightening slightly. You look like him. She smiled, a little shy. They said you knew my dad. I did, Elias replied, gesturing toward the porch. Come, sit. They sat together on the steps overlooking the forest. The air was cool, scented with rain. Ranger patted over, resting his head on Emma's knee. She laughed softly and stroked his fur. After a pause, she looked up at Elias. What kind of man was my father? Elias thought for a long time before answering. He was a man who didn't stay quiet when others told him to. He saw something wrong and tried to make it right, even when it cost him everything. Emma studied the photograph, her fingers tracing the edges. Mom said he wanted to change the town. Elias smiled faintly. He did, and in the end, he did change it, just not the way he expected. They sat in silence a while longer, the sound of the river filling the spaces between words. When she finally stood to leave, Emma turned back and asked, do you think he'd be proud? Elias met her eyes. He already is. She smiled, tucking the photo into her jacket, and walked down the path toward the trees. The sun dipped low, turning the world gold. That night, the cabin felt different, lighter somehow. Elias poured himself a cup of tea and sat by the window. Ranger curled at his feet, breathing slow and even. Outside, the Timber Run murmured softly, not wild, not angry, just steady. Its voice no longer foamed or frothed against the rocks. It had found peace, the way rivers do when they finally carried all their secrets to the sea. Elias closed his eyes and listened. The voiceover began in his mind, quiet, low, like the echo of thought turned to confession. For 30 years, the river kept its silence. It guarded the dead, the lies, the names no one dared to speak. But rivers don't forget, they wait. They hold the truth beneath the surface until someone's ready to face it. He looked toward the faint glow beyond the trees, where moonlight silvered the water's edge. Tonight, Timber Run runs clear again. It carries with it everything that was lost, truth, faith, and a kind of peace that doesn't ask for forgiveness. He took a slow breath, setting the empty cup aside. Ranger stirred, placing his head on Elias's knee. Maybe that's all we ever needed, he whispered. Not closure, just quiet. The river answered, in its own language, a soft, endless murmur, and somewhere within it, Elias could almost hear Lydia's voice again. Not calling, not grieving, just home. And for the first time in 30 years, the man by the window smiled.